Hello, and welcome to another Todd Plays Video Games YouTube video. We're playing Kerbal Space Program again today, and we're experimenting with the Interstellar mod and some of the parts that the Interstellar mod adds for beamed power. So what we're looking at right now is a space station that I put in orbit of planet Kerbin that has a nuclear power reactor. Actually, now we're looking at a second one that has a nuclear power reactor and electrical generator, which are parts of the Interstellar mod, and transmitters. Those giant dishes on the side are power transmitters. So we have nuclear power plants creating tons of thermal energy, thermal heat. Well, I guess all heat is thermal. Creating tons of thermal energy, and giant electrical generators converting that thermal energy into megajoules of electricity, and then gigantic transmitters that beam that energy, that electricity, out into space. There's actually 3 space stations in orbit of planet Kerbin right now that transmit energy, electricity out into space. And here is the launch. We're launching a very small probe, unmanned probe, that is going to collect that beamed energy and use it to power itself, hopefully all the way to Duna. So these receivers, these little antenna dishes that I'm extending right now, these are the energy receivers that actually collect the beamed power and convert it into megajoules that the probe, that the spaceship can use. And so after activating all of them, any of these dishes that are actually getting power will deploy, will open up. And here, these fins that I'm opening right now are another part of the Interstellar mod. These are heat radiators. A lot of the parts in Interstellar mod generate a lot of excess heat, and if you don't radiate that heat safely away from the spaceship, it'll shut down. It'll overheat and shut down. So, in order to receive beamed power, the ship has to have line of sight between one of the transmitters and the receiver, and that's why I put 3 space stations in orbit that can all transmit power. There we go. There we're using the, I think it's a plasma engine. Or is it a super powerful ion engine? Anyway, it's one of the Interstellar mods that, I think it's an ion engine. No, I think it is a plasma engine. It is very similar to an ion engine, just much more powerful in Kerbal Space Program Interstellar mod. Anyway, so there's 3 space stations so that if one gets on the other side of the planet Kerbin, so that the planet Kerbin is between the space station and this probe, the probe can still receive power from one of the other 2 stations, or maybe both of the other 2 stations. And it also needs to have one of the power receivers facing one of the transmitters. So the design of this ship has receivers basically pointing in all directions. I have 6 receivers, and so one is facing in like all of 6 directions, which is effective. It means that this probe can receive energy no matter what direction it's facing to do the burns. But it means it looks kind of silly because the receivers all bump into each other. And at first I thought it was a little unstable because the receivers were all rubbing up against each other. But that actually, the lack of stability, you can see here I'm really struggling as I'm burning to break orbit from planet Kerbin and set a course out of its sphere of influence. You can see that I can't hold it steady. The NX receiver, which is the name of this probe, is not able to fly in a straight line. I'm constantly fighting with it to try to keep it on course. And that is not, I don't think that's because of the receivers bumping into each other like I thought when I was playing initially. I think it's because when they were this close to the power transmitters, it was getting such a large amount of energy that the engine was burning really, really hot. And somehow the engine burning that with that much thrust was causing the instability. Because when we get further away from planet Kerbin, it receives less energy. So right here, I'm far away from planet Kerbin at this point, I think. And I'm just doing a mid-range course correction. to put me on course for Duna, and here it flies straight as an arrow. And of course, because there's more distance between the transmitter and the probe, I'm getting less energy, which means the engines aren't burning as hot. They're not creating as much thrust. So I think that's all it was. I don't like the way all these transmitters, or all these receivers look. Having 6 receiver dishes right on the front of the probe all bumping into each other like that looks kind of ugly. But I've said before, a lot of my ships, a lot of my designs in Kerbal Space Program are functional, if inelegant. And this ship, the NX receiver, is a perfect example of that. This whole thing was an experiment to see if it would work at all. And so it doesn't need to look good. So one of the problems I ran into once I got to Duna was, until I got to Duna, the probe was running with on pure energy, pure electricity. And it was apparently pushing off of the quantum vacuum, which is actually this mod, I think, predates the experiments that NASA did recently, but there was actually an experiment very, very recent where they did use electrical, they used electricity bouncing off of they did something with a lot of electricity that should not have created any thrust, and it did create a little bit of thrust, and they're guessing that it was bouncing off of the quantum vacuum, or particles appearing in quantum space and disappearing, and it's very complicated. Anyway, this technology is not entirely ridiculous and made up. It's actually based on theoretical science, as I understand it. Theoretical science that NASA may have been able to duplicate. So anyway, when we were leaving Kerbin, we were using the quantum vacuum. And when we were making the mid-course course correction, we were using the quantum vacuum. But once we got to Duna, we were not receiving enough energy to do that effectively. The transmission of electricity to the probe was so weak that we weren't able to generate any thrust using just electricity, using just megajoules. So we switched over to xenon. I did pack this probe full of xenon, which is what we're using here, and so using a little bit of fuel and the massive amounts of electricity we are still receiving from those nuclear power plants and transmitters, we're able to generate enough thrust to slow ourselves down. And that's the interesting thing about this. So there's Duna, as we're coming up on Duna. The interesting thing about this beamed power is that it's amazing. The beamed power is awesome, because you don't have to carry any of your power generators on the ship. You have incredible amounts of power being built or being created by incredibly heavy pieces of equipment that you don't have to take with you. So it's a very efficient way to do things. But if anything gets between the ship and the transmitters, you suddenly have no power. And if you don't have a dish pointed at the transmitter, you have no power. And when you get far away, you have very little power. So slowing down around Duna so we actually were in orbit instead of flying past it, was actually super hard. But you can see it worked. I'm in a stable orbit around Duna now. This is amazing. I love this mod. I love beam power, and I'm going to play more Kerbal Space Program using beam power to go all over the place. Thanks for watching.